All right, welcome back to lecture number 40. Today we're talking about historical topic 5.6, the failure of compromise, and our theme is politics and power. And the first learning objective is explain the political causes of the Civil War. So, two key concepts. The first one is the courts and national leaders made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision, but these ultimately failed to reduce the conflict. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the legislation that was going to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska so that they could become states. And this was done with the intent to get a Trans-Pacific Railroad route to go through those states all the way to California. It was proposed by Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois. This proposed Trans-Pacific Railroad would begin in the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. But because these two territories were north of the Missouri Compromise line, southern states wanted some concessions in order for the new states to be created. And so, written into the law, it said that the states of Kansas and Nebraska, once they became states, could decide in their constitutions whether or not they would allow slavery within their boundaries, independent of the Missouri Compromise. And so it's basically throwing out the old compromise and starting a new process of choosing. This is going to get a lot of pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters to move into the territory of Kansas, and violence begins to break out. John Brown, the radical abolitionist, is going into Kansas after some pro-slavery forces in Lawrence, Kansas, had killed some anti-slavery supporters in the region. And so at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, John Brown murders 5 pro-slavery supporters. The bottom picture that you see there is John Brown coming into Kansas. That actually is inside of the Kansas state capitol. The federal government's response to the Kansas violence was really nothing. President Pierce does not do anything, doesn't send federal forces. And the pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides in Congress are riled up about this. Senator Charles Sumner, who was a Republican, spoke out against the violence and the inaction of the government. He made a speech in the Senate, and he called out some of his fellow senators in his speech and their capitulation to slavery and the slavery interests. So here's a quote from his speech. The senator from South Carolina has read many books of chivalry and believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery. So he's personally attacking here a senator from South Carolina, and that senator had a nephew in the House of Representatives. His name was Preston Brooks, who was a Democrat, and in order to defend his uncle's honor, Representative Brooks goes into the Senate chamber and mauls Senator Charles Sumner with his cane. So while Sumner is at his desk in the Senate, Preston Brooks starts to beat him, and Sumner can't get away because he is stuck in between his desk. And this incident is referred to as Bleeding Sumner because it's the name of the senator. The Democratic and the Southern response to this was to send Representative Brooks new canes because he broke his own cane during the beating, and the Republican reaction and the Northern reaction to this was that of outrage. They could not believe that violence like this could have broken out in the nation's legislature. As far as Kansas is concerned, there are 2 constitutions that are written, one that is a pro-slavery constitution and one that is an anti-slavery constitution. The Lecompton Constitution is the pro-slavery one, named after the city of Lecompton in Kansas, where the pro-slavery forces were centered. President Buchanan at this point, it's 1857, urges Congress to approve it to just be done with the issue, but Congress ends up rejecting it. And so the Kansas-Nebraska issue will continue to stay with the Union through the 1860s. And now we have the Dred Scott decision, which is also another incident that made people in the North outraged by what the pro-slavery forces were willing to do. So Dred Scott was a formerly enslaved person. He sues for his freedom based on having been transported to free territory by his enslaver. And his case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. At that point, Chief Justice Roger Taney, who had been appointed all the way back in Andrew Jackson's term, makes a decision. And he decides that at first, Scott had no standing to sue since he's not a US citizen. We've seen this before when John Marshall was hearing a case from the Cherokee tribe in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, in which he said that the Cherokee did not have standing to sue since they were not US citizens. And in that scenario, he dismissed the case altogether and didn't make any decision. Roger Taney, instead of doing the same thing as Marshall had done 30 years earlier, he continues and makes a decision despite the case having no standing. And he says that enslaved people, in the eyes of the US Constitution, were property. And since Congress cannot deprive other citizens of property, slavery was technically legal and all across the United States, and Dred Scott did not gain his freedom by merely stepping into free territory. And then lastly, because of the previous ruling, the Missouri Compromise is now unconstitutional because you cannot create a line that's going to say that in north of that line, U.S. citizens are likely to use their or lose their property, and south of that line, they are able to keep it. On the right side here, you see an excerpt from the decision. Taney says they, referring to enslaved people, had for more than a century before been regarded as being of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. You can see the racial ideology that is baked into this decision, that he does not see African Americans and whites as equal, and so therefore his ruling is going to determine that slavery is legal and moral on these racist grounds. All right, so here's the next key concept. The second party system ended when the issue of slavery and anti-immigration nativism weakened loyalties to the two major parties and fostered the emergence of sectional parties, most notably the Republican Party in the North. So the Whig Party is the one that's going to die out, leading to the end of the second party system. The last presidential election that they run in is in 1852. They run Winfield Scott, who had been a general during the Mexican-American War, against the Democrat Franklin Pierce. The Whig Party, through all of its life, had tried to avoid the issue of slavery in their platform because they were trying to appeal to as many people as possible, and they knew that the issue of slavery was going to divide their support. The party ends up dissipating because they are finally having to start taking a stance on slavery, and that's dividing their support. The Southern Whigs will join the Democratic Party because they're angry that Northern Whigs are anti-slavery, while the Northern Whigs are going to join either the Know Nothing Party or the Free Soil Party or the new Republican Party that's going to be formed in 1854. All right, so the Democratic Party, they, despite surviving this period, are also having problems of their own. The unity of the party is compromised after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Southern Democrats were happy that Kansas and Nebraska could now become possibly slave states, and the Northern Democrats are angry that slavery might be able to spread. In the 1856 election, in order to try and keep the issue of slavery out of the party platform or out of the center stage, the Democrats choose James Buchanan, who had been an ambassador to the UK. And since he was seen as separate from the issue, he was a compromise to try and unify the party. Stephen Douglas, again, the same senator from Illinois who had introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act into the Congress, is the last major figure in the party but he is also very divisive, as we saw with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He will further strain the party during the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. In that election for his Senate seat, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas traveled all across the state of Illinois, having debates to try and see who would be elected into the Senate. And slavery kept coming up during this time. Stephen Douglas had to reconcile his position on support for popular sovereignty and the most recent Dred Scott decision that said that slavery could be legal everywhere. So he's trying to appease the Northern Democrats that don't want slavery to be legal everywhere and appease the Southern Democrats that do want slavery to be present everywhere with his own position of popular sovereignty. And so in the city of Freeport, when they stop to have their debate there, he comes up with this idea that technically popular sovereignty is still a possible answer to the slavery question. Because even though slavery can be legal, technically legal everywhere in the United States, it can only be supported by local laws. And so this is what's called the Freeport Doctrine, that yes, slavery will be legal everywhere in the United States, but if a local government or state government does not want to enforce slavery, then it doesn't have to. It's not going to be forced by the federal government to do so. This is appeasing the Northern Democrats, but it's making the Southern Democrats really angry. And so that's why he's even a more divisive figure. All right, and then finally, the Republican Party. It was formed in Wisconsin in 1854. They run their first presidential election in 1856. And when they write that platform, they are explicitly wanting to repeal the Kansas and Nebraska Act, and they want to repeal the Fugitive Slave Act. So anti-slavery positions are central to the Republican Party from its very beginning. John Fremont, another general from the Mexican-American War, is chosen as their presidential candidate in 1856, and he receives about a third of the popular vote, which is really good for a brand new party that had only been around for 2 years. But it is limited to the North. It is a purely sectional party. They win 11 of the 16 northern states, and in 1856 they realized that given that the northern states have a larger population, if a Republican candidate were able to win all of the northern states, then they would have a real shot at winning the presidency. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln rises to prominence because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen Douglas was the most famous politician in the country. Abraham Lincoln was a one-term representative from the state of Illinois, had very little name recognition at the time, but because he so masterfully debated against Stephen Douglas in that campaign, he rises to the level of a shining star within the Republican Party. And so by 1860, he is going to become the nominee for the Republican Party. In this 1858 campaign is where he gives his famous House Divided speech, in which he says that a house divided cannot stand. From his debates, you see here on the right side another excerpt. The sentiment that contemplates the institution of slavery in this country as wrong is the sentiment of the Republican Party. They look upon it as being a moral, social, and political wrong. So you can see there again that the political party platform of the Republicans had from the very beginning a strong stance against slavery. All right, and then finally, a recap. There were attempts at resolving the issue of slavery, but they made the problem worse and increased tensions. Like the Kansas-Nebraska Act was an attempt to fix the slavery question, but it really just created more violence, and it was a precursor to the Civil War. Roger Taney was the actual worst. He created legal precedent that said that African Americans were not to be treated like citizens and that they were never intended by the founding fathers to be citizens. And it will take the Civil War and 13th and 14th, 15th Amendments to overturn that decision. The Whig Party breaks up because it never dealt with the issue of slavery. The Democratic Party is straining over the issue of slavery, and the Republican Party is created by Free Soilers, former Whigs, and Northern Democrats. And then finally, Stephen Douglas's political ambitions continue to backfire. So the first one was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. then the 1858 senatorial campaign, which he actually won, and then in 1860 when he will attempt to run for president. All right, that was it for this lecture. Thank you for watching, and please come back to watch lecture number 41.